I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to another episode of More Than Kurosawa. And this week we're going to be looking at a classic 1960s Japanese horror movie that inspires many of the great horror movies that we've seen since. I'm talking about the movie Onibaba. But if you're new to this series, what I do every single week is review and discuss a different Asian movie by a different Asian director to help us color in and have an understanding of the wide world of Asian cinema, that there is more to Asian cinema than just Akira Kurosawa, that so many people, including myself, learn a little bit about Asian cinema, maybe some contemporaries, Bong Joon-ho, Hayao Miyazaki, and that's it. But what we really wanted to do with this series is talk about a great movie every single week, but also one by a different director. So there's no repeats. We're not talking about 5 great movies from Kurosawa. We're talking about people who were peers to him at the time, people who were inspired by him, people who are doing completely different stuff, to show you that this is a real strong history, and there are many great films and many great filmmakers if you decide to check them out. So this episode and all the other episodes are a great way to start and learn more about a certain filmmaker or a certain movie. I usually try to make these picks of the movies I'm looking at probably the most easily accessible in terms of availability and streaming services, but also in terms of your likelihood of enjoyment. So if you are interested in the filmmaker like this week in Kaneto Shindo, definitely I think you should check out something like Onibaba. But how we've been structuring these episodes is the first part talking about the filmmaker, because we only cover one filmmaker a week. I want to give my thoughts on what makes them interesting. I've seen more than just this one of their movies. Discuss why I wanted to cover them and what makes them interesting as a filmmaker. And in the second half of the video, have a discussion of the film itself. Why this movie? Why is that interesting? Why does it help us understand and color in a little bit of a different piece of Asian cinema? That's the structure of this show. And as always, if you've seen this movie or if you have any suggestions as to who I should cover next, feel free to let me know in the comments down below. But jumping into things, starting off with why I wanted to cover Kaneto Shindo as a filmmaker and why I wanted to discuss one of his movies is because I think he's a unique kind of intersection between all the different filmmakers that we've covered so far. He's most known, I think, as a horror director because his most well-known movies, I think, are probably Onibaba or Kuroneko. And those are both like folk tale horror type movies. And when you look up some of the best horror movies of all time, particularly some of the best Asian horror movies of all time, you'll get maybe, Kiyoshi Kurosawa, or you'll get great, Korean directors that have done some great horror movies. But I think the kind of beginning point for a lot of people is Onibaba in a lot of regards. So he's kind of associated to that. But then when you look at more of his career, you go, well, he actually did documentaries, and actually he was a part of the Japanese New Wave, like we've been covering on the last couple episodes with Live Today, Die Tomorrow. And then he also did a series of movies about Hiroshima, and these are kind of like very sentimental human dramas. So he's maybe on surface known as like this horror director, but his career is much more interesting and spans in different ways. And that's why I kind of wanted to cover him, because he worked with Kenji Mizoguchi early on in his career, so he has ties to Mizoguchi, and his movies are almost Mizoguchi-esque. He also has connections to Imamura, for example, or last week with Kurosawa in the Japanese New Wave. He made a couple movies in that regard too. But then also he inspired other filmmakers that we've covered, like Kiyoshi Kurosawa, in terms of like the horror aspect. Kurosawa was a little bit later. And then, of course, the titular director that we mentioned in every episode, Akira Kurosawa, he was kind of a peer to Kurosawa, making movies at a similar time, but doing them in a different way. So he kind of touches all of these different points throughout Asian cinema, and all these different types of directors and these different types of movements, always consistently doing his own thing, though, which I think is fascinating. But speaking about his kind of directorial flourishes, he is an intensely smart visual director. That when I watch his movies, I'm always kind of blown away by what he's doing with the camera and how he's telling the story visually. Some directors that we've covered in the past, like Koreeda, are great writers as well as directors, but this one in particular for Shindo, I think is an excellent visual stylist. And he does this thing that I don't know how to exactly call it, but I'm going to call it kind of an in and out camera work. You can call it similar to like a Spielberg oneer or some of the oneers that they were doing in the 40s with like John Ford, because you didn't have a lot of technical capability with the cameras. You had to be inventive in terms of essentially setting up multiple shots within a single take without having to kind of edit. So you don't have, a wide shot and then an edit and a close-up. You have a wide shot and then the actors come closer to the camera, and now without making any edits you have a close-up. So tricks like that, but in particular the in and out move is something that he employed and I found really unique within his movies, where he almost uses, like, if you think of the camera on a dolly, let's say in a square, where he'll start off, someone's telling a story, he pushes in from a medium, closer, slow push in, then we get a close-up. Then we'll move slightly to the left, and then we'll start panning back, and then we'll move right again, and then maybe we'll push in again. And oftentimes employing this when characters are giving monologues or lengthy dialogue speeches. And what's so clever about it is it really manipulates you as a viewer, because when we push in, instinctively us as viewers kind of lean in as well with a slow push in, because we feel like we're getting closer to the actor, and so it's a subtle movement, so we don't necessarily realize we're so close to the actor because we're kind of slowly pushing in. And similarly, when we're kind of pushing out, there's these subtle manipulative things that he does to almost have the story feel more naturalistic, feel like it's breathing, so that the tense moments we're pushing in, but then we'll also kind of push out and breathe more when the stakes of the story kind of decrease. It helps us as an audience member really feel like we're there and we're engaged in the story, just by not cutting, by setting up multiple shots essentially within one camera and not drawing attention to itself, keeping it slow, keeping it controlled, but doing this kind of in and out type camera work, I thought is all throughout kind of his filmography. And then what he also does is he is always interested in place and setting and background. So a filmmaker, like last week we covered Kurosawa, he's not interested in background. If you remember, he used these long lenses, which essentially makes the focus of the actors very clear, but the background very blurry. Whereas Shindo, he's the complete opposite. He uses a deep focus. So we see the trees are just as much in focus as the main characters, kind of how things are in life. And even more so, he goes even further to that by integrating the setting with the character. So that when you see a character, usually you see a character, and if they're on a farm, there's a wheat field, let's say, in the background. And then there's a person here. But there's nothing separating between the person and the camera, or the person and us. But in Shindo's movies, there's always kind of a separation there. So we'll have in Onibaba a field of reeds. And we'll see the reeds in the background, and we'll see the character. But then also in the foreground, there's, it reeds. Or in Kuroneko, there's them walking through the bamboo forest, and you see the trees. And there's always a piece of object or something in between the camera and the characters. And what that does is really emphasize and add to the atmosphere of the movie, the tone of the movie, which is why I think he's so well known for those horror movies, because he's so great at building an atmosphere, at building a tone. And he does that by really placing the characters within the setting. It's a small thing, it's not something that people always kind of recognize, but he always has something interesting in front of the camera, in between the character and the camera, to make sure that we understand that they're in a place, that we're almost kind of observing them, that we're not necessarily in their headspace, kind of an omniscient camera in a way. And it really, I think, helps establish a place and a setting, but also helps us establish a tone, an atmosphere, a mood, so that when we get the horror movies, they're so much creepier because we understand the loneliness or the creepiness or the weird, odd atmosphere that they're in. So Shindo, a really great visual stylist. That's what I think of when I think about him most. And I wanted to cover him because of that, but also because he's kind of got a little bit of all these different filmmakers that we've already covered. So I felt like it was a good jumping point off as more of a middle of the series filmmaker rather than someone we would cover early on. But speaking about the film itself, jumping into the discussion of the film, if you don't know, Onibaba is about this mother and her daughter-in-law trying to survive war-torn or wartime poverty when one of their husband slash sons slash neighbor slash family friend comes back from the war and introduces kind of a new dynamic. And this is mostly known, I think, of as a horror movie, and I think that that's a really wrong way to look at it. This is first and foremost a drama slash thriller, but really just a really well-executed drama. And it feels like a chamber piece or a chamber drama in that way, theatrical in a certain regard too. In that, for the most part of the movie, there's only 3 characters, there's really only 1 or 2 settings. It's pretty limited. And the interest and the tension of the movie comes between the relationships between the different characters on screen. It is essentially this survivalist love triangle, in which usually love triangles we see are with 3 different people, man, man, woman, 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 man, but usually there's an element of sexual attraction or romanticism. And this, there's less of that, and it's more so a love triangle of survival. Because the tension of the movie is, how are we going to eat our next meal? This is war-torn poverty. We need to survive. It's much more of a love triangle based on jealousy, based on companionship, that the 3 of them kind of need each other, but there's always one person in that triangle that one of the other people don't like. So the new kind of family friend man doesn't like the mother, and the mother doesn't like him, and the daughter's trying to maybe look for him as a way of survival and ensuring that she still lives and that she can survive. So it's a small kind of a little bit of an addition to the story. And then in the kind of the 3rd act, we really get the horror aspects, the supernatural, but it does feel more fairy tale-esque or folk tale-esque. Not this movie, but Kuroneko is based on a folk tale, so it has that feeling, I think, too. Mostly, probably because both films set during like feudal Japan period pieces. And even the supernatural element in the second half feels more like a Twilight Zone episode or Goosebumps. It's not a crazy creature film. It's more of a moralistic what-if situation. That is very interesting, and I like how the movie evolves. But I think to think of it as a horror movie is to disregard the first hour and 15 minutes of the movie, in which it really is this kind of tense drama between these 3 characters, where the horror is unsure tensions between the characters and unsure motivations, and that's where the creepiness and the tone of some of the visual stuff that Kaneto Shindo is playing with really come to play as well. And that's ultimately the genius of this movie. It's that it's a relatively simple movie, but with these small twists, these small adjustments that make it very interesting. So the story is relatively simple in its structure, few characters, few locations, love triangle type, but it's not a romantic love triangle. It's almost a love triangle of survival. And then you look at the imagery or the setting, right? It's just two women on a farm, but it's not a regular farm. It's a reed farm with a bunch of, these long type of look like wheat or reeds, and they're running through these fields. So there's like this, you don't know what's in front of you. It's sprawling. You don't necessarily know where you are. So it's a simple farm, but then they've got these reeds, which makes it a little bit more visually interesting. Oh, and by the way, there's also this huge hole in the middle of the ground that always adds to the tension of like, are they going to run into the hole? Where's the hole next? So it's a twist on a regular setting. It's a love triangle story structure, but it's a little bit of a twist. It's not necessarily romantic jealousy. It's survivorship jealousy and companionship. And then the 3rd act of the movie, it's not a horror movie in the sense that there's a huge scary monster. Really, it's the introduction of this man in a mask, and this mask, which has its roots in Japanese culture to kabuki theater. There's that connection where it's a small horrific thing in that it's a mask, and there's some supernatural elements to that, but it's not this crazy scary monster. All it is a mask, and its context is what makes it kind of haunting and scary. So it's a very interesting horror movie. I think if you don't like horror, still check it out, because it's not this super scary movie. I mean, it was made in the 60s, and like I mentioned, I think it's best to think of this as an entertaining, thrilling drama that has a kind of Goosebumps-esque, Twilight Zone-esque morality tale at the end of it, which you can read into as being a political allegory, and there's some great writing on that. I didn't even know really about that at the time and the kind of social context that the movie's trying to comment on. So I think even if you don't need to know that, because I didn't know that, it's still an engaging, taut thriller, really beautiful, especially for a 60s movie. Very interesting frames at every step of the way. It's only an hour 40 minutes long, really an hour and a half. So it's not a super long movie, and I think it holds up very well and feels like a perfect kind of a folk tale that you would tell around a campfire, told brilliantly well with some really interesting visuals and some great acting. It's an awesome chamber piece of a movie that has drama that turns so horrific that it turns into a horror movie without it being super scary, but still kind of thought-provoking, interesting, a very unique movie, and another example that when it comes to Asian cinema, there is more than Kurosawa. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you comment below. Let me know if you've seen this movie, if you're interested in checking it out. And like I mentioned at the top, if there's any other filmmakers that you want me to cover as well, feel free to comment down below. We've got some lined up already that I'm excited to talk about, but there's still many more weeks left to discuss about great, interesting movies, so I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. But that's about it. Until next time, stay tuned.